This project is called GPTs are GPTs. That is, generative pre-trained transformers are general purpose technologies. I'm going to get into what a general purpose technology is, but for now all you need to know is that we did a lot of work to get this title to work. So this is joint work with colleagues at OpenAI and Open Research, Tina Londo, Sam Manning, and Pamela Mishkin. All right, so the big question when it comes to the economics of AI and really any technology always boils down to jobs. And I'm sure all of you have seen something in the news or a paper saying that AI, in particular Gen AI, is about to take a whole bunch of jobs away. These IT-based job displacement arguments definitely aren't new. Now, let me cut to the chase and say that I don't think jobs are going away in general at all. But that doesn't mean that the technology can't have important and profound effects on the labor market. So the last wave of IT, if you look at some of the great work of many people out there, but in particular, David Otter and his co-authors showed that what happened with the first wave of IT is we started to eat a whole lot of routine tasks, in particular routine cognitive tasks, things you do a lot in the same way. And you can write down a recipe that gets you from the inputs to the outputs that explicitly says how you do those things. So we started to prioritize non-routine cognitive work or non-routine physical work as well, and that created sort of a dispersion in outcomes. So it generated a bunch of inequality. That's the kind of large-scale labor market effects we might expect from a significantly impactful technology. Now, if you're going to make an argument that this time is different, and many folks do, especially folks who are building what they hope to eventually be artificial general intelligence or AGI, there are different projections that range from, at one conference, someone said, in 15 years, we are not going to be working anymore. I am keeping tabs on that individual, and we have 8 years left, to, hey, this isn't really ever going to happen. I think if you're going to make an argument that this time is different, that for the general purpose technology era, this is the most G of all GPTs, you could possibly do that with Gen AI, because it does get, as the previous speaker alluded to, it does start to take on creativity as a possible place for us to improve productivity. But, there's some other things we should be, potentially concerned about, and those don't have to deal with the job apocalypse. So, this is kind of new. Someone trained an AI, or asked an AI agent to destroy all of humanity. So far, it hasn't succeeded, but it is trying to tweet a lot to get to that outcome. These AI agents can potentially do quite a lot for us besides murdering all of us. So why do we have reasons to be both optimistic and potentially worried about change? So this is the improvement in the output of image generation models. We're starting from very simple variational autoencoders in 2014, and when I saw this picture all the way to the left, I'm like, wow, AI can generate credible images of faces. Now, they're photorealistic. So massive rates of improvement. We see this across other domains. This is GPT 3.5 to GPT 4's performance on standardized tests. One of the big jumps was 10% on the American bar exam for lawyers to 90%. That's that big green bar off to the left. You also see an absolute mind-boggling explosion in the development of open source technology as a result of ChatGPT, or something else that happens at almost the exact same time, but the simple explanation is probably ChatGPT. So looking at number of GitHub forks here, we go from not too much in the large language model space relative to data science to an absolute, massive jump. To give you an idea of how big this is, that's more than all of the COVID-timed contributions to data science repos around that time. And it's more by like 3x. So tons and tons of development going in. All right, so other things to consider is why these models are so much better, why they're performing so much. So this cartoon is, I'm told, not quite correct. Instead of that much of an order of magnitude increase, think there's like 10 of the little circles, not a massive one there. But the important thing that I've learned from my co-authors in doing this project, what makes these technologies different? Well, one, as we saw with the Llama 2 results, scale helps. We can build much better, much higher scale models, and emergent sort of behaviors start to happen as you get larger. Now that's not likely to be the important thing going forward. Instead, what's important and what's new here is that these models have taste. And the reinforcement learning with human feedback, RLHF acronym, the important one, the important letter is the F, the feedback process. By giving these models feedback for the top K or top 100 results that it generates, we can actually say, okay, this is a good one or that's a bad one with these models. And that's new and potentially impactful. So that leads us to our big research question here. Is generative AI a general purpose technology? Why is a general purpose technology important? Well, if we have a general purpose technology here, that means it's pervasive, it crosses lots of different industries, affects lots of different applications. It improves over time, which for this project, we're going to take that for granted. You've seen some of the rapid improvements, so we're going to say, okay, that's fine. But then importantly, you have to generate complementary innovation to take advantage or to take full advantage of the technology. It's not so simple as plug and play the technology and then you're done. You have to build new systems around it. You have to invest in intangible capital. You have to train workers to understand how this system works. As I tell my students, there's the technology, and then there's the business as a technology or the organization as a technology, and those things have to be configured together. So if you have those three things, then you know that the impact is going to be very, very difficult to predict in equilibrium. So all these claims that 40%, 50% of work is going away, we just can't make claims like that. That's like asking Watt, who just invented the steam engine, to pump water out of mines. What's that going to do to the world economy long run? It just doesn't make sense. So with the methods we're going to develop, and I'll tell you what we do in a second, we're going to try to test these two of these three hypotheses, taking the improvement over time somewhat for granted, to see, is this are GPTs, and if so, that means we can be a little bit more modest about what we claim long-term about the labor market impact. All right, so the first thing to understand is that we're going to take a great data set that the US Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics put together called ONET. ONET describes over 20,000 different tasks that people do. Those tasks are sort of occupation specific, but then there's a generalization of the task called a detailed work activity, or DWA. There's about 2,100 of those and about 1,000 different occupations. The typical job has about 20 to 30 tasks, so there's some diversification benefit you get. Even if AI might even automate one of those tasks, you've still got maybe 29 left to go. So those tasks might be something like, for a gambling cage worker, execute sales or other financial transactions. So that's the DWA, the generalization of it. But then it's cash checks and process credit card advances for patrons. And it's a little concerning that they're processing credit card advances for people in a casino. But there's sort of a generalization there. You can understand where the exposure might be. And that's what we're going to measure with a very simple rubric. So 3 possible outcomes. We take a task and we ask a question: can we double the productivity of a worker doing this task with no noticeable drop in quality? Or, as we prompt both humans and GPT-4, can you cut the time it takes to do this task by 50%? All right, so there's 3 answers to that. Either it's no, you absolutely can't, or yes, you absolutely can, or yes, but, kind of. And that yes, but is you need additional systems, you need other software or retraining or something like that to embed that LLM technology within a broader system to make it productive. All right, so by understanding these 3 different things, we can start to test those hypotheses. Is this technology pervasive? And are we going to need complements to start realizing the gains? All right, so what happens? We ask human raters. These are people really familiar with how these models perform. We work with OpenAI, as well as us. We ranked a whole bunch of these things. You aggregate those to, then we also ask GPT-4 the same questions. Turns out they agree a lot. All right, so on the x-axis here, we've got the human ratings. On the y-axis, we have the GPT-4 ratings, and they tend to be highly correlated. In fact, in many cases, GPT-4 is a little bit more conservative. Maybe it's telling us it doesn't want to do those things and saying, oh, yeah, I don't know how to do that. But, maybe it can. All right, so we run a couple different rubrics for GPT-4, a few different slight variations on the prompt to get rid of some of that brittleness that you might get by relying too much on one prompt. And if you kind of squint at this graph, we're going from humans to the first rating to the second rating, GPT-4. What you'd like to see, if everybody agreed all the time, it'd be like a clear blue line, a clear yellow line, a clear red line. Now, we don't get that. We do get some disagreement, but where we get most of the disagreement is in this yellow category. That's our, perhaps we're, going to need additional systems to realize the gains from this. So the E0, that is exposure 0, the no, you can't do it, pretty much all the models agree on that with some slight variation on the margins where it bleeds into maybe you could do that with additional systems. Or the E1, it's mostly, yeah, you can do that, or you can do that with additional systems, but not a ton of you can't do that at all. So the disagreement happening in that middle category, that's good news for us. We're mostly, if not being perfectly accurate about this, that's kind of an unattainable goal. We're kind of getting the big picture of what's going on. All right, so what do we find? Well, the typical, according to humans or GPT-4, it doesn't really matter which one you do, the typical occupation, about 14% of the role is highly exposed to generative AI. Now, we can look at this a few different ways. Let's, instead of scoring only the ones that are E1 fully exposed, and we say exposure is not good or bad. I'm not talking about automation here. I'm talking about change in the task, okay? So E1 is you can double productivity. That doesn't mean you can automate it. All right, we'll get to automation in a minute. About 15% of tasks are in that fully exposed category. We can also say, all right, maybe you're exposed without additional or complementary innovation, or you're exposed with it. That's our E1 plus E2 category. About 47% of tasks are in that bucket, between those two. And then kind of in between, you have about 30 to 31%. All right, so this exposure is pervasive. We see, the top most exposed roles are some of the things that you'd think would be exposed, like interpreters and translators or survey researchers, mathematicians. Actually, some people said, oh, hey, can't do math, this paper must be wrong. And then like 4 days later, the Wolfram Alpha plugin comes in, and we've got a whole bunch of mathematicians saying how great it is to be able to use these tools. So we were kind of happy about that. So what are the most exposed roles? Well, there's kind of two types. There's quantitative knowledge workers. We see a lot of that. Mathematicians, blockchain engineers. Can't believe that's a job in the category, but we'll take it. Software developers, data scientists, physicists. And then there's another kind of role, like data entry clerks, database administrators, data entry keyers, statistical assistants. It's kind of sometimes there's some knowledge work involved there. Poets, and some other sort of low-level clerical work. So we thought, okay, well, let's look at this by employment and by wages. And something that's new about Gen AI relative to older types of even machine learning or IT is it's the most highly paid, highly compensated work that's more exposed. All right, so expertise as we know it is likely to change. Maybe it gets easier to apply Gen AI to do your work. There's some amazing things, say, in legal services that you can do with co-counsel and related tools. Maybe it gets harder and your expertise becomes commodified, which means that folks in the early stages of that career might be able to do things that folks in the later stages of that career take for granted, but really took a lot of training. On the other hand, by employment, we don't see a ton of correlation. All right, so we can look at this by what's called a job zone. Job zones, the highest job zone is like where the most barriers to entry are. Think about doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, that sort of thing. Versus places where there's low barriers to entry, you don't need a ton of change. And again, we see this kind of comport with the last set of results, that the most training intensive, the highest knowledge value work tends to be more exposed. So I think that's what's generating a lot of the anxiety in the media is places where you've made really big human capital investments. Those are places where we're going to start seeing a lot of risk being both good and bad. All right, so you might be concerned as well that Gen AI is just limited to some industries. We find that most industries have a meaningful amount of exposure, but data processing industries like software or banking, those tend to be more exposed. You also might be worried that the lowest productivity sectors are not going to pick up any of this, right? Healthcare, education, housing. If those sectors aren't going to benefit, then those are going to balloon to be even more of our overall spending in the economy. It's something called Baumol's cost disease. But kind of nicely, I was happy about this result at least, is we don't see any correlation between the former productivity growth of the industry over the last decade or so on the level of exposure. So that means that we have an opportunity to change those things that are becoming expensive and hard to improve productivity with Gen AI. So I'm very excited about this opportunity. I know we're going to speak a lot about risks throughout this conference, but I want to caution everyone that the bounty from this sort of technology is absolutely enormous. So I think it's, from an economic perspective, we're giving up a lot in terms of well-being and happiness to say, okay, these risks outweigh the benefits. We just have to. It can't be the solution that we've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas, right? We got to come to those ideas. So, all right. So the next question: are we going to require a lot of complementary investment? I already kind of alluded to this, but the amount of things that become exposed or not exposed on the basis of this E2, the exposed but category, it just expands really enormously if you start to include those things. So there's a lot of building to be done, and that's why I like to say if we even stop developing LLMs or related technologies today, we'd have a decade or more, before we were out of innovation with this stuff. So for those three different categories, yes, it's pervasive. Yes, it's going to require complementary innovation, and we're definitely seeing improvement over time. So they're general purpose. All right, so the elephant in the room here, of course, is what's exposure relative to automation? Well, let's move over the most exposed roles and look at the most automatable roles. We built a rubric to say, okay, you can do this task with just LLMs and no people. And the things that pop out of that are jobs like telephone operators, telemarketers, word processors and typists, credit authorizers, order clerks, these sorts of things. So low-level routine cognitive work, that's the sort of stuff for low compensation routine work. That's the most exposed to automation, which rhymes a lot with the last wave of IT. So if we're going to be looking somewhere for displacement, it's folks, even though the most exposed roles are at the highest ends of the wage distribution, there are folks at the low ends of the wage distribution that we have to be concerned about. All right, so one last point on that, the exposure overall and the automation exposure are also highly correlated. So this distinction that we make that you can automate or augment, that may not really be a distinction. Within the same roles, there's often a lot of things you can augment and a lot of things that you can automate. And that balance is going to determine in the long run what the equilibrium is going to be. One last check we did, well, we asked people on the ChatGPT Discord, what do you actually use ChatGPT for at your job? This graph is a t-SNE embedding. And what you're looking for here, the black circles are what people said they did. The blue circles are the yes, but category. The gray ones are the absolutely not, and the orange ones are the absolutely yes. And what we're hoping for is that there aren't that many black circles in the gray area. That kind of shows that we didn't say you could do stuff that you can't actually do. And what we found is, yeah, people mostly do what we thought they could with these systems. But lots to fill in there. All right, so to wrap up, I'm going to ask this question, is this time different from an economic perspective? Here's supervised learning. We cluster all the tasks and look at these different communities. You see factory workers over here, scientists, therapists, and clergy. They're all colored by their exposure. This is to supervised learning, actually. You can see that clergy is not super exposed, no machine god yet. But we move through here, and you can see that there's a cluster of things that supervised learning does well. All right? There's likely a similar kind of clustering for generative AI, but we'll see what that is. So takeaway here, we're going to have to wait and see. Our evidence suggests that the equilibrium is going to be really hard to predict. We can't make claims like jobs are all going away or even 40% of jobs are going to go away. But we can, and with this data, we have a tool for picking up where the highest levels of impact are going to be and where things are going to change. And that's enough for us to start making some preparations for how policy is going to change. So, to think about where we should be looking at things, the job's probably the wrong unit of analysis. You're going to want to think about tasks. Where can we discretely apply generative AI? And you're going to want to think at a level above the job at systems. So where are demands for work overall going to be changing? But if you look at jobs, those are kind of instrumental and hard to find. So with that, I'll wrap up. I'm happy to take questions. And if you have additional questions you don't get to ask, feel free to contact me. Happy to chat. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Daniel. That was great. If you have questions, please make yourself known. See someone in the back.
Thank you for the talk. So, very specific question regarding these exposure analysis on mathematicians. So, how do you even define the productivity of a mathematician? What is the kind of job specification that you chose to analyze this?
So, again, when you do these kinds of rubrics and even prompts, whether it's humans or machines, trying to be too fine-grained about it can lead you astray. Like if you were to ask me, are you going to be 10% or 15% more productive in the task? I don't know. It's hard to say. But if you want to say, hey, it's going to cut the time it takes to do something by 50%, then people have a rough sense, and so does GPT, on how much more productive you can be. So for a mathematician, a task might be, write a proof, right? Are you going to be much faster? Are you going to be, possibly slower? Like if you use GPT, for the mathematicians I know have started to use GPT in their work, and it needs to have some bolt-ons as well. They are much faster when they start to use this. It kind of handles some of that. Nevertheless, you're still responsible for the output. If you write a proof and it's got an error in it, and it's because GPT, hallucinated, that's on you when you try to publish it, right?
I mean, for example, you mentioned about proofs. Like, it's not about speed. It's like, can you even prove it? Like, those kind of things, right? Qualitative, that I find difficult for learning models to answer for. Like, can learning models design algorithms, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's opportunity to work with algorithms there. I'm not worried at all about mathematicians. I'm sure they're going to continue to produce a lot, and probably even more with this relative to other things.
So thanks for the somewhat comforting perspective. I'm looking for a historical perspective. If you had done the same analysis, let's say for steam engine, electricity, transistor, whatever, what do you think the result would be, and how would you compare them, in terms of magnitude of impact to those inventions?
Absolutely. So with Gen AI, on the latter question, what's the magnitude of the impact? I don't know. I would have very wide confidence spans around it, with a point estimate of maybe it's roughly like the internet. But in terms of the historical perspective, yes, we have lots of good examples. The IT revolution, I think it's in the last 40 years, don't quote me on the exact timeline, but something like 60% of the work we do today didn't exist back then. So, and in terms of full automation of jobs, there's only been one job that's been fully automated in the post-war era, and that's elevator operator. So I did tell that to one group of people, and a guy raised his hand and said, well, my building has an elevator operator. And I said, okay, well, you've got the one there, buddy. But yes, transistors, the steam engine, all of these different inventions radically changed what people do, but they didn't eradicate work overall. And that's the kind of disruption we want to think about. For a great paper on that, one more thing, Feigenbaum and Gross talk about the automation of switchboard operators by AT&T, and that took 90 years, but it's also one of my favorite papers. They detail who benefited and who paid costs there. Yep.
There's a question up there. Do we have microphones still?
Thank you. So we are talking about magnitude, but another factor we should maybe take into account is also the speed, because we are talking about new skills and a job shift. But as a human, are we able to cope with the speed of these changes?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one of the reasons we don't put speed estimates in the paper is because even with the co-author team, we disagree on what that speed is. I'm a cranky economist. I think it's going to take a while. There's other folks who think the adoption is going to be much more rapid, and we've seen, especially with ChatGPT's adoption, it was explosive, right? Like, if you're teaching classes, you pretty much have to have changed. So I think it's very heterogeneous, and when you think about what's going to be a bottleneck versus what's not, there's potential, say, upstream disruption that could be very quick, but then it's going to hit a bottleneck, and that's going to be very slow. And things like writing, composition, writing essays, or even emails, I think speed's pretty quick. And obviously, I think the Hollywood writers have a point. There's a lot that can change very quickly there. On the other hand, telling me that software engineers are going to go away, I'm deeply skeptical, because I think they're going to change what they're doing, incorporate it, and the best will be even better. If I had to guess.